The second witness for today's hearing is former Treasury Secretary under the Bush administration, Secretary Henry Paulson. Mr. Paulson, please stand as I administer the oath. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? If so, answer in the affirmative.
I do.
Right. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that he answered in the affirmative. I'll ask the witness to summarize his testimony in 5 minutes, and of course, we know the procedure. You know, the yellow light means you have a minute left, and the red light means stop, and then, of course, we will have time to raise questions with you. You know the procedure. You've been through this quite a few times, so good to have you back.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I will go through this quickly. First of all, Chairman Towns, Ranking Member Issa, and distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the invitation to testify before this committee. I was Secretary of the Treasury in 2008. In that role, I had the privilege to work with many talented men and women in government and the private sector who labored to pull our nation back from the brink of disaster. The decision to rescue AIG was correct, and I strongly supported it. An AIG failure would have been devastating to the financial system and to the economy. Today's hearing relates to payments to AIG's credit default swap counterparties. I was not involved in any of the decisions made with respect to those payments, nor was I involved in any of the decisions about AIG's public disclosure of those payments. Those matters were handled by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Federal Reserve Board. They sought to make appropriate decisions on those matters, and I am confident that this review will show that they did. I have limited knowledge on the topics of immediate interest to the committee, but I will share the following observations. The rescue of AIG was necessary, and I believe that we in the government who acted to rescue it, including Secretary Geithner, Chairman Bernanke, and me, acted properly and in the best interest of our country. The reasons the rescue of AIG was necessary are well worth examining. I believe they are representative of the causes of other aspects of the crisis and indicate where regulatory reform is necessary. There are 3 reasons we needed to save AIG that stand out in my mind. First, AIG was incredibly large and interconnected. It had a $1 trillion balance sheet, a massive derivatives business that connected it to hundreds of financial institutions, businesses, and governments, tens of millions of life insurance customers, and tens of billions of dollars of contracts guaranteeing the retirement savings of individuals. If AIG collapsed, it would have buckled our financial system and wrought economic havoc on the lives of millions of our citizens. Second, AIG was seriously underregulated. Although many of AIG's subsidiaries, including its insurance companies, were subject to varying levels of regulation, the parent entity was, for all practical purposes, an unregulated holding company. Consequently, there was no single regulator with a complete picture of AIG or a comprehensive understanding of how it was run. It was not until AIG started to fail that regulators began to understand how badly managed it had been and how much the toxic aspects of parts of its business had infected otherwise healthy parts. Third, AIG could not be effectively wound down. Unlike failed depository institutions, which can be taken over by the FDIC with little or no harm to depositors, or the GSEs, which were seamlessly placed into conservatorship by Treasury and the Federal Housing Finance Agency, there was and is no resolution authority available to wind down a failing institution like AIG. The only option is bankruptcy, a process that is simply not capable of protecting the millions of Americans whose finances are intertwined with AIG's. The government rescue of AIG in the fall of 2008 was directly shaped by these realities. We had to protect the economy and the finances of millions of Americans. We could not have anticipated the magnitude of AIG's problems, and we had no way of letting it fail without disastrous collateral consequences. We had to intervene, and I'm thankful we did. I do not mean to say that I'm happy we needed to intervene. Taxpayer money should not have to be spent to save a misguided and mismanaged enterprise. But the fundamental problem lies not in how we intervened, but why we needed to intervene. We need to modernize our regulatory structure by creating a systemic risk regulator and resolution authority so any large firm that fails can be liquidated without destabilizing the system. Large financial institutions in this country will always play a role that is essential to our economic growth. But they must only be permitted to grow and interconnect throughout our economy under careful oversight and with a mechanism for allowing those connections to be broken safely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Let me say that you were deeply and aggressively involved in dealing with the financial crisis, and we saw that with AIG, of course, and Bank of America, and with the TARP. My question is, why did you sit on the sideline and not use your considerable influence to call the CEOs of the counterparties and to get them to take a haircut? I mean, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, you a person that was very influential in all of this, you know, and I can understand why you wouldn't do that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you indicated, I had no involvement at all in the payment to the counterparties. No involvement whatsoever. Now, to explain this, we worked very collaboratively during the crisis. There was a lot going on, coming at us from all sides, and whichever agency had the authorities took responsibility for execution. And this was clearly a case. It was a Federal Reserve loan. They had the authorities to make it and administer it, and they had the technical expertise to do the restructuring.
But, you know, I just see it a little strange that you would sit on the sideline and not help the American people in terms of, I mean, you were so involved in the early stages, and you were, I mean, and throughout the process, and then to sit on the sideline at a time like this, I just find that.
Mr. Chairman, anybody that knows me know I was not sitting on the sideline. I was not involved in this issue, but I was involved in many other issues every single day of the week, and including weekends. So I didn't spend.
Why not? I mean, why wouldn't you be involved in this?
Because this was a Federal Reserve loan. They had the authority. They had the technical expertise. And I said in my testimony, I have great confidence in the professionalism, the integrity, the motives, the abilities of the people that were handling this. So this was their job to handle, and I was working on many other things which were in my bailiwick.
Let me ask another question then. Why wouldn't you let AIG go into bankruptcy? Why not?
If AIG had failed, this was a huge financial organization, interconnections throughout the economy. If it had failed with the system as fragile as it was, I believe it would have taken down
Could
the
you
whole.
talk back into the microphone? They're having
I believe it
problems
would have
hearing
taken
you.
down the whole financial system and our economy. It would have been a disaster. Today, after all the actions that have been taken by the U.S. government, we still have this terrible 10% unemployment level. I believe that if the system had come down and failed, we could easily have had unemployment reaching or exceeding the 25% level we had in the Great Depression. We would have lost many additional billions of dollars in American savings. The home prices would be much lower than they are today. So as unattractive as the government rescue of AIG was, and none of us that supported that found that to be an attractive or desirable option, it was just much, much better than the alternative, which would have been economic disaster in this country.
Right. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we go to the members who did not have an opportunity in the first round. And Mr. Chairman, I'd also ask us one thing. Will you agree, since the Secretary said he would answer our questions, to join with me in ensuring that all questions are answered, or that we bring the Secretary back, assuming he does not answer them for some reason?
Ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Lukermeyer would be next to those waiting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paulson, one of the things that we're looking into here with the AIG, can you explain to me, is AIG and their financial products, was that a subsidiary of AIG, or was that part of their business model?
I believe it was part of the business model.
There wasn't a separate entity that was separately capitalized?
It was clearly at the holding company, and it was part of.
Because I think
it wasn't part of an insurance business model, but it was sure part of the company's business strategy.
Because it makes a big difference. If it's not part of the insurance part of the company and it's a subsidiary that's separately capitalized, you can let that thing go down and it doesn't impact the insurance part of it, which I believe it was. Is that not correct?
Well, I would say this to you. This company was so big and intertwined that it was, if there was any way that the people who were working on this could have found a way to just hive off and let one small part of the company go down.
Would the gentleman suspend? Mr. Paulson, excuse me. We want to make sure that members can hear your testimony. And, you know, it's amazing with so much money in this federal government, we don't have a better sound system. But I'm going to need you to speak as closely to that mic as you can so everyone can hear you. Thank you. You may continue.
So to just be clear, there was no way to hive off and handle this situation differently. There was a very few days to act to prevent bankruptcy, with no wind-down powers to let this company be liquidated and avoid bankruptcy.
Well, with all due respect, if it's a separate entity, a subsidiary, it could go down and the rest of it could still stand on its own, sir. But that being another, let me move on here with another question very quickly. In Secretary Geithner's testimony, he indicated that he felt that contractually the contracts that we had, with the investments that were made by foreign banks into AIG that they were involved with, need to be adhered to and worked with. Was the government a part of those contracts?
As I've said in my testimony, I had no involvement with the payment of any of those contracts. I just was not involved in that matter.
So the government wasn't a party to the contracts then?
But
the government wasn't part of the
again,
contracts.
this was not something that I was directly involved in. I've said that I very much trust the motives and the abilities and the judgments of the people that made those decisions, but I wasn't party to them, and I can't answer that question.
Well, that's one of the frustrations, and I appreciate your candor, but it's my frustration with the chair, and that we don't get full testimony, be able to get all the questions answered, asked and then answered, so we can come to you with what we feel is good information to be able to get some good back and forth here. So I apologize to you. Let me move on to something else. I know right now we're looking at, and the President's proposed some too big to fail sort of strategies to try and address the issue of too big to fail. Where are you in this debate? What do you think about the proposal that's on the table right now, sir?
When I was Secretary of the Treasury, I put out a regulatory blueprint, and I still believe that is a way to go. I am I think it's essential that we have wind-down authorities, resolution authorities, so that any financial organization, no matter how big, can be liquidated outside of the bankruptcy process without taking down the rest of the economy. And so I think that is essential, and there are some parts of the of the proposals that are up here being debated by Congress, which are the same as in the regulatory blueprint we put forward, a big one being the systemic risk regulator, and I'm strongly in favor of a systemic risk regulator.
Do you believe that we need to take the risk investments that are part of many of the big banks right now and take them off the books and set up a separate subsidiary for this? So we can sort of go back to a Glass-Steagall firewall there?
That is not my recommendation. I believe that when you look at the crisis, what I saw in the crisis was it was across a number of types of financial institutions, and the excessive risk-taking I saw was not limited to one business activity. It was much broader than that, and I think we need a broader approach. And so, again, what I favor is a systemic risk regulator and wind-down authorities is the way I would handle that.
Well, one of the problems I have with that, with what you're suggesting, sir, is that suddenly now we have the taxpayers through FDIC insurance on the hook for these risk takers who are out here. I think it's important that we take these things off the books and have a separate subsidiary that if it goes down, it goes down, and the banks and the insurance funds and the taxpayers as a whole are not on the hook for all this. I think it's very important we go down that road, because I think what you've done with AIG is suddenly use the federal government as the official underwriter of all investments in the world. If we're underwriting foreign contracts, investments, what have we done? We've gone down that road, and I appreciate your comments, and I yield back to the chair.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, in keeping with the necessity of making sure the members who did not ask questions in the last round are given a chance to go first, we recognize Mr. Tierney. Thank you for your patience, and you may proceed for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paulson, thank you for being here this morning. So you were in full agreement with not allowing AIG to go bankrupt?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think back home people don't know where to give the credit for this, so I want to make sure we give credit where credit's due if that was a good decision. People see Mr. Geithner now as treasurer, and I think that the decisions were all made by him when he was treasurer. In fact, these were decisions made in 2008. You were President Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, correct?
Absolutely.
And Mr. Bernanke was the head of the Fed. And then, of course, we had the New York Federal Reserve Board participating in these conversations as well. So that's pretty much the group that decided that they should give $85 billion in September to AIG. Those are mostly the participants, am I right?
Yeah, we were, as I said in my testimony, I very much supported that, that rescue.
Okay. And then in November, it was the same group. You, as President Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Bernanke, and the New York Fed decided to give additional funds to AIG, some of which were used to pay the counterparties to the contracts, right?
Yes. In November, in the TARP, we made a $40 billion capital investment, and then the Fed put some additional money in to which was used for the contracts.
Well, and just so we're clear, we're giving credit here. The TARP, the $700 billion in TARP, in fact, was during your term as Secretary of Treasury under President Bush.
I'm proud of that. So
okay, and that was your idea, was it, the TARP?
That was a number of our ideas, but yes, and that's something I'm proud of, and it's something that was very necessary.
And the $85 billion that was loaned to AIG was not appropriated by Congress. Nobody asked Congress to make a vote on that, am I right?
No, that was a decision taken by the Fed with the support of Treasury.
And what money, what source of money did they use to get that $85 billion?
They used their funds.
And their funds emanate from where?
From the U.S. government.
Well, were they fees from other banks? Were they come from your Treasury? Where did they come?
They come from the Fed. Obviously, can print money.
Okay, and did they take money that they had from fees charged to member banks, or did they print money to accommodate this $85 billion?
You'd have to ask the Fed that.
All right, you're not aware during the discussions where that was?
I'd like them to answer that question.
Well, you may not like to answer the question, sir, but if you know the information, I'm asking you to share with us what is your best understanding of where that money came from.
My best understanding is all dollars are green, so those are ultimately taxpayer dollars, and that was why...
We're painfully aware that they're taxpayer dollars, sir.
That was why the Treasury was supportive, and we were very supportive of that transaction.
Okay. We all understand that the full faith and promise comes to the government on that, the taxpayer dollars. We're painfully aware, but I'm asking you whether, since they didn't come to Congress for an appropriation, whether the $85 billion came from fees charged to member banks, was newly printed money, or some combination of the both.
I don't believe it came from fees charged from member banks.
All right, thank you. Now, we got to the point where a decision had to be made about whether or not to let AIG go bankrupt. Later it came to a point whether or not to pay the counterparties 100% on those contracts or not. But once the decision made not to let them go bankrupt, you lost any leverage, really, to argue in terms of getting to being able to pay less than 100%. Is that a fair statement?
As I said, I didn't participate in the in those decisions regarding payment, and I also said we didn't have the wind-down powers.
Okay. But, you know, you were involved with, I forget how many Congressman Kaptur said that there were phone calls between the New York Fed and you, I'd yield 225 telephone conversations between the head of the New York Fed and you during this period of time. So I think we might be fair in assuming that you were discussing some of these matters?
Well, we had many matters to discuss.
And this was one of them,
over a range of things, and the matters we discussed, we clearly discussed the rescue. As I said, I did not have involvement and was not
Here's my final question. I need your help with this. Most people at home hear people draw the conclusion that not to allow AIG to go into bankruptcy would have been devastating because the consequences would have been severe. It would be enormously helpful if you could put yourself in the position of the local bookkeeper for a medical firm, or housekeeper, or lawyer, or teacher's aide. How specifically would that individual have been harmed if you had not made the decision to not allow AIG to go bankrupt? What would have been the consequence to them?
And that's the right question, Congressman, because they were the real victims. They would have lost jobs, would have lost...
But how? How would that have happened? Show me from the time you made the decision what would have spiraled down to affect their lives.
Well,
the gentleman's time has expired, but the witness would be pleased to answer his question, I hope.
Okay. What I believe, we were at around the time of the AIG rescue, when markets were frozen, we had a situation in this country where even blue chip industrial companies were having trouble financing. I knew we were on the brink, that if AIG had gone down, I believe that we would have had a situation where Main Street companies, industrial companies of all size, would not have been able to raise money for their basic funding. And they wouldn't have been able to pay their employees. They would have had to let them go. Employees wouldn't have paid their bills. This would have rippled through the economy. Today, Congressman, we have, after everything that was done, all the resources, we have 10% unemployment. I believe we easily would have had 25% unemployment. Today, we have home prices that have dropped precipitously in some parts of the country. Home prices would have gone much lower. AIG guaranteed tens of billions of dollars of savings for retirement savings for Americans. There would have been great losses. This would have been an economic nightmare.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson.
Thank you,
Chair recognizes Mr. Souter.
Thank you. I've got a variation of the same question you were just going through, because one of the problems we have is that it appears that AIG was treated differently than other companies throughout this whole thing, in this sense, that the holders of the debt were paid at par, which means that in effect, the banks got 100%, but for example, GM creditors, small businesses all across America, and in other companies that were let go, they got 10 cents on the dollar, 30 cents on the dollar, and it's part of a fact, but a perception that that was unfair, that Wall Street was covered but Main Street wasn't in debt. Now, AIG was different in what sense? Now, I know, was it 120 separate finance companies and 80 insurance, or is that flipped, something like that? In other words, it was a collection, it wasn't one.
It was a big, complex collection of companies, correct.
In that if the insurance divisions were separated and came under state, part of the argument is state regulation, that they were so intertwined with the finance. But let me ask one other question before we get into details of that. You said bankruptcy wasn't an option. but it also meant that did you try to put pressure on the people who held the debt to write down some of their debt, or once you made the statement we weren't going to let it fail, were they just playing hardball and saying we weren't going to write down anything? Why didn't they get the same pressure that GM suppliers had and everybody else to write down their debt?
As I've said, and this isn't me trying to suggest anything was done wrong, I had nothing to do with that. So I was not involved in the negotiation. I was not involved in anything surrounding those payments. But I will explain one thing to you, which is fundamental for you to understand, is the government, we have an antiquated regulatory system and a lack of the necessary authorities. And so if there was a bank, there is a way to wind that down. But this was a non-bank, and there was.
I understand that.
There's no way to avoid.
Let me ask you. There's no way except the threat of real bankruptcy, and that if you're a bank and think you can negotiate at par and get a full percent and you don't have a threat of bankruptcy, the question is did anybody threaten them? Did anybody say that if we're not going to, did we in effect yield the debate at the beginning, they played hardball and we had no way to do it, that if in fact you would have to say, hey, we can cover the insurance people, but the finance side over here, you better negotiate down or that side will go bankrupt, and then you'd wind up probably having to do what we did in TARP anyway, which is put cap to try to cover the fact that we've just had to put more money in the banking system, but not necessarily at par.
As I said, Congressman, I didn't. As I said, I wasn't involved in that, so I can't.
You're saying the New York Fed did that.
I can't comment beyond what I've said.
That when you got involved, once TARP was there, the decision was already made that it wasn't going to go bankrupt. Is that correct?
Well, first of all, I was involved in supporting the initial rescue, and then...
So you were involved. Just a second. You were involved, and did you advise the Fed to try to get what they could and not pay at par?
What the Fed, the initial rescue was not when they dealt with the payment to Counterparty. So I supported the Fed on the initial loan, and then later in November, the situation had deteriorated to the point, and values in insurance businesses all around the world had deteriorated to the point that this was a company that would go down without capital. And so now we had capital, and my team and I participated in making that decision, made the decision to put $40 billion of equity into AIG.
The problem that I have is that it appears to me that AIG was treated differently, so much so, even listening to that, it's like, well, we put some money in initially, and then we put more money in because they couldn't fail, where in the other, everything from Citibank to Merrill Lynch to everything else, there were processes where there were conditions on money coming in, where there were guidelines on money coming in, and they used the leverage of the threat of bankruptcy to do that. Then in this case, it appears that it was different, and it partly is that the creditors are different. Furthermore, that some of the critical information here was withheld from being public at the request of the New York Fed, that had that been public, people would have seen it. And there was an attempt to even keep it quieter because that was critical, that information, to understand what was going on behind. And it is extremely frustrating to all of us on this committee, and you can hear it in different types of questions, about how this came to be. And I don't think there's been a compelling case made that AIG is unique.
Has expired. But I would say that if Mr. Paulson wants to respond to the gentleman, you may do so, and if not, we'll go to the next question.
No response.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Kanjorski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Mr. Paulson. You really miss Washington, I assume.
You can't guess how much.
I listened to the comments of the Secretary, your successor, and now you, and I'm listening to the members' questions and how much memory is lost in a year or 14 months from those fateful days in September and October, which all of us hope we never relive, but in fact were very much significantly different than today, and the coolness of being able to answer. One of the questions I was particularly interested in, because I was very involved at that time with AIG and what was happening from my aspect of having some jurisdiction over insurance, is that, as I understand it, because of financial products in London was without assets and had a tremendous involvement in counterparty positions of about $2.8 trillion, and whose counterparty positions were starting to fail and they had to honor them, their initial internal decision of AIG was to use the assets of the world's largest insurance company, and they sought permission, and it was pending and finally approved by their regulator, the state of New York, to take assets out of the insurance companies, about $30 billion, and use those assets to cover their exposed counterparty positions. Now, if that had happened at that time, those insurance companies would have failed because their assets would have been taken, converted, and they wouldn't have been enough to cover the counterparty position, so it would have wiped out the insurance companies, which in turn would have affected every insurance holder in the country that was involved with AIG at the time, and would have been a catastrophic collapse of the insurance industry, notwithstanding the counterparty and derivative position. Now, luckily, the regulator in the state of New York didn't grant us permission to use that $30 million until much later, when it was futile. And at that point, the losses on the counterparty positions, I think, rose to $55 billion and were climbing on a daily basis. And that's when the infusion of funds that you talk about, adding equity to AIG, or the capacity through the use of government funds to cover those counterparty losses. They didn't cover all those losses, and subsequently, within probably 30 days, another huge amount of money was infused into AIG's various corporate structures to get some stability. And not that I could say nothing has changed from that, but that was the significant circumstances in this month or 2 months after September 18th that everybody was faced with. But as I understand it, the Federal Reserve was the person with the checkbook under the instance, under 313 powers. They were just plugging that money in, and it wasn't a decision made at the Secretary's level of Treasury or at the presidential level. It was a Federal Reserve regulator level who was making that decision, and I dare say regulator not for AIG, but regulator that had regulation over some of the largest banking institutions in the world, that if they had been if their counterparty positions weren't honored, they would have immediately collapsed. And that's what we were calling the meltdown. Everything was going to implode, and you had to stop it at the headwaters, not wait until it got out into the little dams out of the stream. Is that relatively the correct position?
I would say, without signing off on every fact you mentioned, I would say you've got it, in the sense that this was a very complex company, and there was, if it had gone into bankruptcy, it would have been a huge mess, and it would have one part of the company would have contaminated the other, and it would have rippled through the U.S. economy, and the result would have been absolute disaster.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I know there are other questioners. I've had the opportunity to ask some today, so I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his courtesy. Before I recognize Mr. Bacchus, I want to take the liberty as chair to recognize students from Padua Franciscan High School in Parma, Ohio, who are visiting the Capitol and seeing their government at work right here. So welcome, you and your teacher, and we're pleased that you stopped by for a visit. Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Bacchus of Alabama.
Welcome, former Secretary. Secretary Paulson, March 2009, March 16th was when AIG the payments were made to AIG or guaranteed. Leading up to that, you participated in several meetings about AIG, is that correct?
Prior to March of
2009?
Prior March, yeah, I had a number of meetings about AIG as we were putting in capital.
I know one of the meetings, I'm looking at March 24th, my questioning of Mr. Geithner. He mentions, Secretary Geithner, that he said that he and you met with AIG to discuss Lehman's failure.
Discuss what?
September 14th. Now, that was 2 days before.
Oh yeah, yes. You're saying, so you were talking about 2009, right. March, and I think you're talking about September 14th, 2008.
That's right, okay. All right. I stand corrected, I am. That discussion, but you participated in some of the discussions about AIG and their financial condition leading up to...
Yes, and the weekend of September 13th and 14th was a weekend when we were had financial institutions together working to come up with a solution to prevent the failure of Lehman. And it was that weekend that we learned also about AIG, and I had 2 meetings over the course of that weekend at the New York Fed with Tim Geithner, with officials from AIG.
Right. In those meetings, was there any discussion of asking the counterparties to take less than 100%?
Was there any discussion of what?
Any discussion of the counterparties taking less than 100%?
I sure don't recall any. We were talking about the financial problems that AIG had, and it was clearly they clearly had issues with counterparties.
Right. What?
They clearly had issues with counterparties because that was the crux of the issue, was what was a potential ratings downgrade, which would cause the company to have to post collateral. And so that would lead to dispute.
So their obligation to the counterparties was discussed.
Well, obviously that was the issue. Any institution that is facing failure,
sure,
is going to have an issue with paying creditors.
Sure. I'm not. Once that intervention occurred, then the taxpayers, the U.S. government, owned 79.8% of AIG, more or less. I guess that's correct, isn't
it?
Yep. That being the case, I see in this same 3/15/2009. Now this is skipping forward to March of 2009. Secretary Geithner emailed William Dudley and Edward Quince, and he said, "Where are you on the AIG counterparty disclosure issue? Are you for disclosing or not?" Now,
would the gentleman yield? Could you put up slide 1, please, so they could see it? Thank you.
What would your advice have been on whether or not that should have been a public disclosure of the counterparties and their obligation? And would the fact that really the taxpayers own over 79%, almost 80% of the company, have made any difference?
Well, as a general proposition, I'm very much for disclosure, but I wasn't part of this. I had nothing to do with that decision, and I am not going to sit here now and second-guess others that were, that I know people with,
sure.
with strong integrity and goodwill trying
right.
to do the right thing.
Well, just take a situation where you do have a company that's 80% owned by the U.S. government. Would that tend to make you think that there ought to be disclosures of their obligation?
Well, public companies.
The gentleman,
public
time is Mr. Paulson, the gentleman's time has expired, but you can answer his question.
I'll be brief. But public companies have disclosure obligations, and that's governed by the SEC, and I think those need to be adhered to.
Thank you.
Okay, I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes Mr. Cummings of Maryland. You may proceed.
Mr. Paulson, good seeing you again. Let me ask you this, Mr. Paulson. Do you Do you realize that a lot of the American people believe that there's a sort of Wall Street club, and that, let me finish, that you all play golf together and you have a lot of fun, and then you know, when the billions come around, you're able to kind of distribute them? I mean, I'm just saying, do you know that that's how people feel?
I sure do. And even though
Can you keep your voice up?
I said, even though I'm not a golfer, I sure know that's how people feel.
Yeah, and they when they see these deals going on, then the next thing they do is they begin to look at where people worked. And then they see the relationships, and then they say, well, you know, we don't have a chance, because it seems like they're kind of looking out for themselves, but not looking out for us. And so, you know, you just gave a statement about transparency, and you know, and I think one of the things that bothers people is when they don't see transparency, then they begin not to trust. And when they begin not to trust, it becomes very difficult for them to go along with any program. And then when you put on top of that, that they can't see themselves benefiting. And I know that you mentioned that if we didn't do what we did, and unemployment may have gone up to 25%, but it's hard for people to even see that. You understand?
Yeah, Congressman, you've got it. And that's, people are very, very angry, and I understand it, why they're angry, and they're rightfully so, because they don't see the connection. And they don't recognize that what was done wasn't done for the banks. It was they were going to be the victims if we didn't step in.
And so among the conditions in the TARP, AIG, SSFI, investment senior preferred stock and warrant summary of senior preferred terms as posted on Treasury's Department's website, the following condition is noted. Quote, the annual bonus pools payable to senior partners in respect of each of 2008 and 2009 shall not exceed the average of the annual bonus pools paid to senior partners for 2006 and 2007. Do you believe it was appropriate for Treasury to allow AIG to create any bonus pool for senior partners, considering it had just found it necessary to extend $40 billion to the firm through the TARP?
I'm not going to get into second-guessing decisions that were made at Treasury about bonuses. I realize this was a very difficult decision, because the taxpayer had a lot of money in this company.
Right.
And this company needed to perform well and needed to hold the team together in order to repay tax.
Right. And the taxpayers were saying to themselves, look, these are our tax dollars. We worked hard for these tax dollars, and now these guys who screwed up everything are getting bonuses.
Yeah, you're right. No one, me included, likes to see private business profit from taxpayer assistance. That makes people angry. And to me, I just hope that part of that anger is not a diversion from what we need to do, but is an incentive to fix the system so that we'll have resolution powers, and never again will we'll have a company that's so big, too big to fail, so the taxpayer has to come and put money in, that a company can be liquidated and wound down in a way in which the taxpayer's not on the hook again. But so I understand there's that anger out there and that frustration. I think it's very understandable, and I think there's a number of ways to do something about it, but the best way to do something about it is reform the system so that we don't ever again have to bail out a big institution, rescue a big institution. It can be liquidated if it fails.
Now, with regard to the original Treasury TARP investment in AIG, was this structured as a loan or as an equity investment?
Congressman, it was an equity investment.
And was this in the AIG parent holding company or in the individual subsidiaries?
This was in the parent. This was a $40 billion equity investment because the company needed equity.
And was it made subordinate to any other creditors of AIG?
Well, a a preferred is, by definition, senior to the common and subordinated to the other creditors.
And how does this compare to the various Federal Reserve investments in AIG?
Well, this would be, this is subordinate to the other Federal Reserve investments in AIG, because a determination was made. The rating agencies basically said that you need to put capital in this institution or there will be a downgrade, and then it would have precipitated the failure.
And why was it structured in this way?
It was structured in that way because that's the way a preferred needs to be structured. That's where it wouldn't have been capital if it hadn't been subordinated to the other to the other liabilities.
I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Stearns from Florida. You may proceed for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paulson, Mr. Geithner has testified that he recused himself during this counterparty negotiation. Did you know that while you were Secretary of Treasury?
I knew that.
Just yes or no?
Yes.
You did know. Okay. Did you know
Tim
that
Geithner
he did not sign?
did not participate in any. I didn't view him as a decision maker. I viewed him as recused.
Did he call you up and advise you that I've recused myself? Did he call you up? How did he notify you?
Well, he told me on the phone that he did not think it would be appropriate for him to be viewed as a decision maker.
Did you know he never got a letter? All he did, he testified that he recused himself. He decided. He put up a flag and said, I recuse myself. I'm not going to be involved with the counterparty negotiation. Didn't get a, like you went to the White House counsel and you went to the Secretary of Treasury, you got a letter. He never got a letter. He never got a written confirmation of his recusal. Did you know that? Do you know that he was just doing it on his own, by his own volition?
I did not know the details.
Okay. Did you think a person who would recuse himself in this crisis we had, that he could go about and operate in his present job and not have a conflict of interest? Did you ever occur to yourself to say, gee, the chairman of the Federal Reserve is in this crisis, we're having the counterparty negotiations, and by golly, he's going to step aside and says he knows nothing about it. That's what he's saying today. Doesn't that seem sort of fakey to you?
No, it didn't, because I thought it was an extraordinary position we had to have a president of the New York Fed Treasury, so I thought it was a reasonable.
He said in open testimony that his chief of staff, while he was chairman of the Federal Reserve, was a former employee of Goldman Sachs. Did you know that?
Yes.
Did you ever call the chief of staff, his chief of staff, former employee of Goldman Sachs, during the process of the counterparty negotiations? Did you ever call? If I go to the logs, will I see your name calling him?
His chief of staff, who was a former employee of Goldman Sachs.
And he worked for you when you were CEO.
Didn't take on that job until after I had left, and he had become Treasury Secretary.
Did you ever call him at all? If I go back to logs, will I find that you called Geithner's chief of staff, former employee of Goldman Sachs, during the counterparty negotiations?
Yeah, no, I didn't.
You never called him?
There's, as I said, the former, his chief of staff, I think the person you're referring to.
Well, we didn't know about it until today.
Is someone who became his chief of staff when he became Treasury Secretary after I had left office.
No, but he said that while he was at the Federal Reserve, he was his chief of staff. That's what he said today.
I don't believe that was the case.
Okay, all right.
But in any event, when he was, when Tim was
okay, let me just go on. I have the time.
I talked with Tim.
Here's the problem I think a lot of us are having. Mr. Geithner said he was not involved with the counterparty negotiations. You're saying you didn't. You were not involved. Oh, yes, you heard a little bit about it. But on November 6th, when they gave $62 billion to all these parties who came in and looted AIG, all you guys say, I knew nothing about it. And yet it appears that this happened. Now, recently, Michael McWraith, who's director of the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, told the Senate Banking Committee, he said, you know, if AIG had gone in bankruptcy, we would have taken care of it. It would have been an orderly disposition. This is what he said. AIG's insurance operations and their other companies would have simply bought up AIG's insurance assets, allowing a seamless delivery of AIG's insurance obligation. So the question is, considering that the state insurance commissioners would likely have seized AIG's insurance subsidiaries, protected policyholders in an AIG bankruptcy, why was it necessary to bail out AIG with taxpayers' money? based upon the testimony of the Director of the National Association of Insurance Commissioners.
I respectfully disagree with him, and I believe that if
So you disagree with this guy with all his knowledge and his years of experience?
I will just say many people with years of experience had some regulatory responsibilities with regard to AIG, but this company had a huge problem, and it is case number one on what is wrong with our regulatory system. There was no single regulator that had a line of sight on the total company. So there were regulators that looked at different pieces of it, and if the company had gone down, it would have been a huge mess.
Is your testimony, Mr. Geithner sort of implied, he scares members of Congress, he scares the public, we are all scared. He said if AIG was not bailed out, this country would have collapsed. He intimated our Constitution would not have been able to be enforced. There would be a revolution in this country. Do you think it's at that extreme? If we let AIG go bankrupt, we would have had that kind of collapse and revolutionary spirit in this country? Is that what your position is today?
I certainly have never said that, but what
He implied that.
What I've said is I believe we would have had an absolute economic disaster.
And our system of government.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Paulson, thank you for being here today. Now, in your testimony, you state that in your capacity as United States Treasury Secretary, you were not involved in any decisions with respect to payments to AIG's counterparties, and that you were not involved in any of the decisions concerning AIG's disclosure of those payments. I'd like to accept that at face value, Mr. Paulson, except the critical decisions concerning payments to counterparties were made after the passage of the Emergency Economic Recovery Act by Congress at your request. And the Emergency Economic Recovery Act made the Treasury Secretary responsible for the use of funds authorized by Congress. Negotiations on the counterparty payments by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York did not begin until November 6, 2008, and the funding of the payment of the counterclaims was backed by funds made available under the Emergency Economic Recovery Act. So, Mr. Paulson, doesn't it make it your responsibility to know how those funds were used?
I think you will find, Congressman, and I think TARP reported this, that the TARP investment, the $40 billion TARP investment, was equity, and that those funds did not go into this maiden lane vehicle where the Fed loan.
So you didn't have any knowledge of the counterparty
I did not, no.
payment transactions?
I did not.
Are you telling us that?
I did not.
And are you telling us that you were not aware of any of the discussions leading to the counterparty payments with any of the principals? You weren't.
That's what I'm telling you.
And you're telling us that as Treasury Secretary, you had no role whatsoever in the decision on counterparty payments, that you didn't ask anyone any questions, that you never expressed an opinion on the matter, that you were completely unaware of the nature of proposed transactions until it was consummated, and no one asked you any questions about how these Emergency Economic Stabilization Act or the Recovery Act funds would be used to stabilize AIG, the one financial institution more than any other that was at the heart of the crisis. You just didn't know.
Congressman, we asked a lot of questions about the $40 billion TARP equity investment. That was something that was our job, and it was our authority.
Did you ask about the nature of the counterparty payments?
And as I said, the loan, that was a Fed authority, and they had the authority and the technical expertise to handle that. And that was their job, and we were consumed with other matters, and had great confidence in them to carry out their responsibilities very professionally and well.
Well, Mr. Paulson, no one disputes that you worked very hard throughout the crisis. It's well known you were personally talking with senior executives at all major financial institutions on your now legendary cell phone, which I might add is in the Museum of American History. But how is it that you played no role in the handling of this AIG relief, that you didn't have an interest in it. How is it that despite Goldman Sachs' extensive role as a counterparty to an agent for AIG in the transaction, your extensive personal network of associations within Goldman, which extended to several Goldman alumni on staff at Treasury, that you can say that you didn't have any knowledge and by implication no influence over the transaction? I don't understand that.
Well, it can't be any clearer. I assumed that Goldman Sachs knew that Goldman Sachs, and I assumed most other major financial institutions were counterparties, but I had no knowledge of what the individual claims were, and that was my concern here, was not about counterparty claims when we rescued AIG. My concern was about what was going to happen to the American economy and the American people. And again, you need to understand, when we worked together, the Fed and Treasury, we had different authorities, different responsibilities, and there was so much going on that we had a lot to do, and they had the authority and responsibility for dealing with the loan and
the thing that I have trouble with, though, is that the government gave Goldman Sachs, your former firm, a better deal than it had a right to expect. You heard the previous testimony here. It's mystifying how you, as Treasury Secretary, this could happen and you not really know anything about it. And unless you recused yourself from any discussions about AIG or about Goldman Sachs?
I didn't have to recuse myself because the fact was no one discussed it with me, consulted it with me. I was involved in other matters. This was a Federal Reserve authority, and they had the technical expertise, and that was their job.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
You're going to... No, I'm saying we have votes on the floor, and of course, we have 4 votes, and that we, due to a previous agreement with Mr. Paulson, that we're now going to allow him to go.
Mr. Chairman, could we ask if Mr. Paulson could stay just for 5 more minutes to complete on our side? 2 people will split time.
2? Well, let me just put it this way then. Now, who else has not had an opportunity to? Is 1, 2, 3.
Right. Mr. Paulson?
Could you give us another 7 minutes and let me split 3.5 and 3.5?
Does that work? Yeah, okay. We can look in.
Mr. Chairman,
well,
I would be willing to put mine in writing to Secretary Paulson if he'd be willing to respond within a certain given time, rather than...
Yeah, Mr. Secretary, yes.
Well,
Mr. Secretary, there's a request in terms of if we give the questions to you in writing,
yes,
you will respond.
We will get back to you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yes.
Mr. Paulson, you were...
Let's see how we're going to break this down first.
You were one of the chief operating officers of Goldman.
Gentleman yield. You're going to give us additional 7, 8 minutes?
Is it okay?
Okay, good. All right, so we'll break it down 4.
You were
It
one
really
of the
will be 8 minutes, right?
Right, 8 minutes.
You were one of the top officers for Goldman Sachs, right?
Yes, the top officer.
And some of the people that work for Goldman Sachs went to work for Mr. Geithner?
I believe I know.
Yeah. And when you left Goldman Sachs and went to the Treasury, you were there 3 years and you got $200 million in tax benefits because you didn't have to pay capital gains on $500 million worth of stock, right?
I would strongly disagree with that.
Well, that's what's been reported.
Because, let me just explain.
Okay, well, it's okay. You can respond. I'll send a question to you in writing. Okay. The concern I have is the same concern that Mr. Stearns had. You came before our conference very nervous, saying, oh my gosh, the sky's falling. We got to come up with this money very, very quickly. And you actually were visibly nervous when you came before our caucus. And then we have this bailout of AIG, and you don't know anything about it. Mr. Geithner had nothing to do with it, It just really boggles the mind that some of the biggest people involved in this whole thing from beginning to end had nothing to do with it. They didn't know. It was it makes you want to think that some clerk someplace was making these decisions. I don't think anybody's going to buy that. You and Mr. Geithner and others were directly involved in making this decision, were you not?
Of course we are directly involved, and I said it in my testimony. I heard Mr. Geithner's testimony. I heard him say the same thing. I was very supportive of that decision to prevent the failure of AIG.
Go to gentleman. Who's next on this on my side? Mr. Lynch.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
2 minutes.
Right. Mr. Secretary, I need to make this happen in 2 minutes. You were centrally involved with the negotiations regarding Bear Stearns when you insisted on a very, very low price on the part of the Bear Stearns shareholders in order to protect the taxpayer. It has been reported that you were very supportive of a $2 a share price in order to protect to protect the taxpayer's interest. And yet, in this situation with AIG, and you were the CEO of Goldman Sachs back in 2006, there was a long-standing relationship there between AIG and Goldman Sachs that you were well aware of. Goldman Sachs was a major counterparty on a lot of these credit default swaps with AIG when you were the CEO at Goldman, and that relationship continued after you left. You would have known that these people that Goldman was exposed here with these credit default swaps when the money went from the taxpayer to AIG and through to your former company. And I guess the question that everybody has here is, why, when you insisted on Bear Stearns taking a big haircut, why did you allow Goldman to be reimbursed, your former company, at 100 cents on a dollar in that situation? Why did you not weigh in on behalf of the taxpayer?
As I've said on a number of occasions, I did not know, I had no knowledge of the size of the claim of any bank, and I had no involvement in a decision to make payments to the counterparties. None whatsoever. I was very supportive of the rescue of AIG because a failure of that company would have been disastrous.
Especially to Goldman Sachs.
Gentleman's time has
expired. It would have been disastrous to the American people.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paulson, I want to clarify the chain of events surrounding the original request for the TARP dollars, original request of Congress. You came to the Congress, everyone in this committee, I think everyone in Congress would admit, you came to us in September, said we need the money to buy troubled assets, toxic assets. As everyone knows, at some point you changed your mind. When did you change your mind and decide you weren't going to purchase the troubled assets, you were going to inject capital into the banks? When did that happen?
I changed my mind. I came to Congress on September 18th.
Congress first voted it down. October 3rd, we voted for it. When did you change your mind?
It was our strategy when I came to Congress to buy illiquid assets, purchase illiquid assets.
When? We got 2 minutes. When did you change your mind?
And it was, but by the time...
Before the vote on October 3rd or after the vote, when did you change your mind?
I had begun considering putting capital into the banks as one option as we got near the final vote, but I had not changed my mind yet on the strategy. And I will say one other thing to you. Right up, even after we put capital in the banks, which we were forced to do by
what is it?
changing
Did you change your mind before the vote or after the vote? Because we have the
I changed my mind. I changed my mind after the vote because I did not change. Can I just say this? I did not change my mind on purchasing illiquid assets.
We have the slide
until mid to late October after we put the capital in. After we put the capital.
So just so I'm clear, you're saying you didn't change your mind until after the vote. So I want to point to this the book, David Wessel's book that came out in the Fed We Trust, page 226, 227, and you've just been given a copy of what it says. House of Representatives rejected the Bush administration's bank rescue plan on the 29th of 2008. The next morning, Mr. Paulson ran into Michelle Davis, the spokeswoman and policy coordinator in the Treasury building, quote, "I think we're going to have to put equity into the banks." He said, despite what Paulson had told Congress, buying toxic assets was going to take too long. Davis gave him a blank stare, quote, "We haven't even gotten the bill through Congress." She remembered thinking, how are we going to explain this, she told her boss. We can't say that now. He took the advice. So, again, I'm asking you, was it before or after? Because you've said two different things. You said I started thinking about it, but you said I didn't make the decision until after, but you sold the Congress on the simple fact that you were going to buy the troubled assets. That's why they needed the money.
If you would let me,
And your spokeswoman directly contradicts that.
Congressman, let me answer the question. Give me a minute to answer the question. During that period, when Congress was acting, the situation worsened considerably. As we got near the final vote, I was beginning to be clear to me that we were going to need to think through other options. But long after, even after we put capital in the banks.
Did you express that concern to the Congress?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Even after we put capital in the banks, it was still my intent to proceed with an illiquid asset purchase program until we got into late October.
Let me ask you one question. Is that
I'm
statement
sorry,
accurate? Is the statement on the screen accurate, Mr. Chairman? I think it's important for the committee to know that.
I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Paulson. And I accept your testimony that failure to enact the financial rescue plan would have led to, as you said, economic disaster. When you and the President Bush, came before the Congress in an emergency, you submitted a plan that did not include, at the time, a mechanism to make sure that the taxpayer would recoup any dollars that had been extended to the financial sector. The Congress, at that time, inserted a provision requiring the President, whoever that President may be, to submit a plan to recover those funds on behalf of the taxpayer. President Obama has now done that in proposing a fee, and my question to you is, do you agree that given everything the taxpayer did to save the financial industry, that in addition to taking measures to prevent this from happening in the future, we should also make sure that we put in place a mechanism to recover the monies that went to Wall Street and other financial banks as part of the rescue?
I do agree with that, but the provision that was put into the TARP legislation contemplated looking at a 5-year window. And at the end of that 5-year time period, if the taxpayer hadn't recovered the money, then there was going to be a tax. Now, today, as I look at the circumstance, the money is going to come back from the banks, in my judgment, with a profit to the taxpayer. And it's too early to tell about to what extent the money is going to come back from the rest of the program. I frankly think the taxpayers will end up being pleasantly surprised, and much more will come back. So my only question about the fee, the tax that's being suggested, is it too soon to make that judgment, number one? But most importantly, I don't want that to take our focus off of dealing with what is a real problem. We better fix this system so it doesn't happen again.
But would you agree there should be a mechanism in place to ensure that at the end of the day, the taxpayer recoups 100% of the TARP monies?
That was the intent of Congress, and I think it was the right thing to do. I agree.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson, for...
Congressman,
yes.
Woman, I had agreed to stay for another 8 minutes. It's been 10 minutes.
For that reason, I dismissed the gentleman who had the time to tell him his time had passed, and I would, and for the committee, and especially for Chairman Towns, may I thank you for not only 8 minutes but 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'd like to call the third panel.
Just back on the front where I was at.